Professor, good morning to you, and thank you very much for joining us. Maybe as a starting point, I could ask you this question. How do we, or how should we, use art to understand politics?
Jeremy, particularly when it comes to the way that nations imagine themselves and construct themselves, visual imagery play a very important role. Not just high art, but also monuments, obviously the obvious things, but also architecture and graphic novels and photo comics and advertisements, etc. So this book looks really at how an abstract concept, like the way we imagine a nation to be, becomes constructed culturally through visual images.
So how then does a particular art form emerge that represents either a group of people or an idea or an ideology?
In this particular instance, Afrikaner nationalism is particularly interesting because we saw a very programmatic, ideologically motivated construction of a national imaginary emerging in the 1930s. And of course it was partly a product of the Anglo-Boer War, the South African War, which left the Afrikaner quite destitute, and also with a very wounded pride. And at the moment we're seeing so many resurgent nationalisms across the globe, so we need to understand the mechanisms of how nations construct themselves and why they do so. And it is usually a kind of a way of taking power. You know, the 1948 election victory for the National Party was quite unexpected. Nobody saw that coming. And it was the result of this very programmatic national program, a way of creating a folk in this particular instance, and an exclusive white settler imaginary that then determined the course of South African history throughout the 20th century. And now in this decolonial moment, we have to understand how this actually occurs. And in a way, popular culture plays an even more important role than high culture in this regard.
As far as the art that we're talking about is concerned, Professor, are you able to tell us whether there was a definitive style to it? Are you able to describe the imagery, and was there a common thread through the art and the sculpture that we're talking about?
Yes, it depends on whether you're looking at so-called high art or monuments, or whether you're looking at popular culture. Obviously the style will change to speak to a different kind of audience and a different kind of viewer. But I think there are certain threads that run through it. In other words, a kind of idealized prototype for the ideal masculine, Afrikaner masculinity, which would be a quite rugged kind of frontier masculinity, and then if the femininity would look quite different. Professor Lumery Kruger wrote about the imagination of the volksmoeder and what kind of, how the nation becomes gendered. And of course the nation is also very racialized. First of all, the black population is sort of written out of the narrative largely, and that happened across all the settler domains, which is why we have the decolonial moment happening now. You know, when we imagine an American, a stereotypical American, we think of a white American. We think of Trump more than we think of Barack Obama. And the reason for that is that our imaginations are shaped by these visual images. And that is why we felt it's important to revisit this at this moment, where there are so many dangerous, resurgent and intolerant nationalisms emerging across the globe.
It's interesting, you also make the point in the piece that you have written that there's a degree of sublimation as far as this is concerned, because many white South Africans who were born and reached maturity during the apartheid years, and I guess myself included, would tend to recognize the full impact of all of this only with hindsight. And that's the point that you're making. We only start to realize what we were looking at years later.
That is absolutely right, and that is where visual culture is so important, because it takes an ideology and naturalizes it. It renders it natural. So the idea of an all-white nation, where in fact we were a total minority and a very privileged minority, nonetheless the nation, the concept of the nation, was naturalized as entirely white. And in order to do that, you have to visually construct such a nation. And television played its role, photo comics played its role, children's books played a role in this regard. You know, absolutely all visual culture plays a really important role. You know, Benedict Anderson, who is the prime author about nationalism, has said that nationalism couldn't have arisen as a phenomenon without the emergence of print culture. Because a nation is an imagined construct. You know, you don't know the other people in your nation. The only way in which you can imagine this abstract thing of a nation is through visual imagery. And that visual imagery determines very much how you look at the nation. So the construct changed throughout the apartheid era. For instance, there's a chapter there by Gary Baines that's very interesting about the militarization of masculinity in the 80s in response to the border war and conscription, and the role that photo comics like Grensvechter played in that regard. So that national imaginary keeps changing to reflect a current state of affairs. Like in the 1950s, the high art scene became very sophisticated as the Afrikaner made a bid for modern sophistication and competitiveness with other nations. So it's not one set of figures that just keep repeating. It also evolves and changes as the nation changes.
I want to ask you one last question, if I may. Your critique also says the public domain still includes numerous sculptural commemorations of key figures within the white Afrikaner imaginary. So my question now is, how should art like this be viewed in 2020? We also know, Professor, that many monuments have suffered desecration. That is understandable for many communities. How should they be preserved?
You know, there's a lot of debate about this, Jeremy. It's not an easy question to answer. Some people feel that we should actually keep, well, our heritages compel us to keep these monuments, but that we need a lot more information about them. Professor Brenda Schmalman, who's one of the co-editors of this book, has done a lot of work on this, as has Professor Jonathan Jansen, who also wrote a chapter in this book, to argue that it needs to be accompanied by a lot of historical contextual information to help people understand this. On the other hand, you know, the decolonization movement feels that the presence of these monuments is insulting, that having to view this on a daily basis is actually not acceptable. But at our university, Stellenbosch University, for instance, students have done interventions with these sculptures where they engage with the sculptures in a way that tries to speak back to the kind of ideological power that these sculptures exert over their environment. And there isn't an easy answer to this, but it's a global problem across the especially former settler domains like the United States and Canada and New Zealand, etc. And it's a question that urgently needs to be addressed, but there's no easy solution.
Professor, thank you very much indeed for joining us in Cape Town today.